All right, this is a different method of factoring trinomials. Now, when you take a test, you can use either method, because I put problems on there where they don't give you intermediate steps where you have to use one method or the other. It'll just say factor the trinomial completely, something like that. And you can use either of these methods, or if you learned a different method and checked it with me, you can use a different method as well. These different methods, in quotes, are actually just different ways of doing the bookkeeping, basically. So this is called the AC method of factoring trinomials. The reason is because the first step you do is you take A times C. So that's the leading coefficient times the constant. Well, actually that's the second step. The first step is what? The first step with factoring is always factor out a common factor if there is one other than 1. In this case, even if the common factor was -1, you would factor it out. Okay, so find A times C. Okay, then write out all ways to factor A times C. Now you might say, well, that would just be A times C or minus A times minus C, but that's not true because you're multiplying the numbers out before you do the factoring. So write out all ways to factor AC. Then the next step, you find factors of AC that add to B. Now, when you do write out all ways to factor C, that includes negatives. Okay, so if AC was positive, you could have negative. A and C could both be negative, or A and C could both be positive. If A and C is negative, one's negative, the other is positive. And you would write out each possibility. Then you find the ones that add up to B in your list. Okay, then this is hard to do without knowing what the actual numbers are. So I just put it this way. Say the factors from step 3 are D and E, ones that add up to B. Then you write ax squared plus dx plus ex plus c. So what I did is I took that bx term, since d plus e is b, I took the b term and I split it into dx, the bx I split into dx plus ex. Right? So now I've got 4 terms, and I can factor it using the method we have for 4 terms, which is factoring by grouping. So remember, I would group these two and factor out a common factor, or if that doesn't work, I switch these two around and then factor it that way. And if the trinomial factors, one of the two will work. Well, if it didn't factor, you wouldn't have ever found a D and an E that add up to B. It wouldn't have worked. So I'm going to do factoring by grouping. So you might want to go back and review grouping, factoring by grouping, that subsection, before you do this subsection. Okay, so here's an example. So that's certainly much easier to explain than the other method, right? That took me a page and a half. Okay, example, factor 2x squared plus 7x plus 6. First, I look for a common factor, that is a factor common to all 3 terms. There isn't one, because the middle term is 7. 2 is not a factor of 7. Okay? And 1 doesn't count. So A times C is 12. 2 times 6. Read out, how can you factor 12? Factor this into 2 integers whose product is 12. Well, 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, with all positive. And I'm just going to ignore it. You could also write out -1 times -12, -2 times -6, -3 times -4. But if you're smart, you notice that, or once you practice a bit, you notice that the middle term's positive. Everything's positive, so everything here has to be positive. So on this one, I'm not going to worry about the negatives. If there was any negatives here, maybe I'd write out the negative possibilities too. Okay, and then I want to know, okay, the sum of these two things has to be 7. Right? So that's 3 and 4, 3 plus 4. So it's very simple, right? It actually works a lot more like when we did factoring a trinomial whose leading coefficient is 1. It kind of looks a lot like that, except up to this point, right? So now you write out with the 3 and the 4 as the middle terms. So 4x and 3x. And I put the 4x on the left and the 3x on the right just because 3 as a common factor with 6 and 4 as a common factor with 2. So it just looked like the 4 belonged with the 2 more than the 3 did. See? But again, if this way didn't work, you would just flip the two middle ones. But this does work. So now you factor by grouping. So I'm grouping them this way. And so I'm going to factor out a common factor here, which is 2x, greatest common factor, right? And then the common factor in the second two is just 3. And then notice that these two are the same. So I can factor out the x plus 2 now. And I get 2x plus 3 times x plus 2. Again, if you don't understand this part, it's because you don't understand factoring by grouping. Go back and do some problems to make sure you remember how to do it from the section on factoring by grouping. Because obviously you can't, because this is actually a much easier method than the other one for most students just beginning factoring. For me, the other way is just as easy, maybe even easier. But if you're just starting, this is easier. That's been my experience with students anyway. And then check it by multiplying it out. Always do that. So you've got what? What have you got? You've got 2x times x, so that's 2x squared. Check. The constants, 3 times 2 is 6. Check. The middle term is inside and outside, right? So 3x plus 4x is 7x. Check. Okay, and then I put a box around it, and you could put a box around yours too, and then put that inside in the program on the website. And that's it for that example. One more video with I think it's just one more example.